Hello everyone, I'm Dan O'Ferns, one of the Bio 122 lab professors, and this week's lab we're going to be talking about plant diversity. So there's four main groups of plants that we're going to be talking about. They're the bryophytes, they're your seedless vascular plants, our gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So we're going to kind of go through what makes a plant, and then we're going to talk about each one of the individual groups. So all plants are made up of eukaryotic cells. They are photosynthetic and autotrophs. So that means they utilize the energy from the light of the sun to break apart and carbon dioxide and help it to make sugar molecules, which are then sent up and down the plant. Last but not least, plants undergo an alteration of generations. An alteration of generations basically means you have an organism that at one point is a full diploid, so it has full sets of chromosomes, and then it undergoes a completely opposite side of its life cycle where it's haploid or only a single half. So that's kind of like the sexually reproductive stage and the stage that supplants that sexual reproduction. So all four categories of plants begin as diploid. They go through a haploid generation, and then that haploid generation goes back to being a diploid generation. Plants undergo the alteration of generations. So there are two distinct generations within a plant's life cycle. The first is the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte generation has a full contingency of chromosomes, is known as diploid. The gametophyte generation is the haploid generation of the plant's life cycle. So in your lab this week, you'll notice that you're going to be filling out those charts that have the full life cycle. Now the plant's life cycle runs in a complete circle. So if you can find a point to start, it makes it a lot easier to understand. So the sporophyte generation is that full contingency. So it is able to undergo meiosis. Now, once meiosis has happened, you get your haploid spores. These spores are one gametophyte, they're one N, and they will turn into the gametophyte. So you have the smaller plants becoming the gametophyte. Now, the next part is mitosis. So the gametophyte generation is able to kind of expand, grow larger, and then undergoing mitosis, it's able to produce the gametes, which are your sperm and egg. These gametes will fuse together during fertilization, which will then form the diploid zygote. Now, during each stage and in between each stage, there's two parts that are very distinct. Meiosis only occurs after the sporophyte when it's becoming and turning into the haploid spores. And fertilization only happens after the gametophyte has produced the gametes of the sperm and the egg. Mitosis, however, can occur at any point that you have replication of the cells in the growing of an organism. So when we're talking about the sporophyte and gametophyte generation, depending on the type of plant family we're discussing, you're going to have that dominant generation. The generation you see is going to change from the sporophyte generation, like in pine trees, versus the gametophyte generation being the dominant generation as we see in bryophytes. Bryophytes consist of mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. The small little brown things that you see above the green is the sporophyte generation, and that contains the sporangium for bryophytes. The dominant generation and the green generation that produces the energy is the gametophyte generation. This is that longer living haploid generation. Bryophytes themselves are not true plants because they lack true roots, stems, and leaves, and they require moisture in order to reproduce. Seedless vascular plants have true roots, stems, and leaves. However, they still need to be near water in order to reproduce. They require water to help move the sperm to the egg. Additionally, they have transitioned from having a gametophyte dominant generation like that in the bryophytes to having a sporophyte dominant generation. However, in this case, both the gametophyte and the sporophyte generation are autotrophic and able to produce their own energy. Gymnosperms are your first group of seeded plants. They develop pollen so that the sperm could be carried to the egg through the wind. These are held in cones, so you have the staminate cone for the male, the ovulate cone for the female. This allowed for gymnosperms to reproduce without the need for water. The dominant generation in the gymnosperms is the sporophyte generation. The gametophyte generation takes place within the cones only. Angiosperms are flowering plants. They're the most common and typical plant you're going to come across. The dominant generation is the sporophyte generation. The gametophyte generation lives and takes place entirely inside of the flower, except for pollen, which is transported from one flower to the next. Angiosperms utilize fruits to help their seeds get a better chance at dispersal and survival. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please email your professor and ask those questions. I hope this was super helpful in getting you started and ready for your plant diversity lab.